Hello everyone, it is Michael. I just finished being on a trip that, basically it was celebrating my birthday, and every year what I try to do is I try to do something new that I've never done before. And this past year, the objective had been to do a cool safari trip to Africa with some friends, but it turned out everybody abandoned me. I could maybe drag one person along, the other people weren't able to make it work. And at the same time, I had some obligations in Northern Italy, at some conferences that one of my companies is involved in, and I was asked to speak there. And so I figured, all right, well, that was not going to work out with the dates. So I would be in Northern Italy, and what would I do about that? Well, the logical conclusion was to go and do some sort of a trip there. And so while I did that, I ended up reading the Leonardo Da Vinci biography by Walter Isaacson, which I'm going to talk a little bit about today as what's it like, and also my perspectives on sort of what the things were that I got out of it and how it inspires me in my life. We ended up kind of theming this whole trip around a Napoleonic tour. Napoleon's first campaign was through Northern Italy, starting in Nice, and so I flew into Milan, drove to Nice, picked up some friends, and we kind of swerved all over Northern Italy, going to all the places that Napoleon had had these famous battles, essentially to sort of relive the history. And it was a really cool way. It was a bit like National Treasure as you're searching for these cool little places that, something happened, some ruins, etc., which are typically not that well marked. So it's kind of a fun game in that regard. But also it's a really cool way to see parts of Italy that you wouldn't normally see. People normally travel to Italy, and what do? They go to Milan, Florence, Rome, maybe Sorrento, Naples, a few of the major places, but they don't see these dozens and dozens of small little towns that are really quite excellent. And you could just start driving, but I think it's much more fun to go and do it in something with purpose. And so super cool trip, was fantastic. And I took it as an opportunity to learn about Da Vinci, since of course he was from Northern Italy. So I'm going to give you my thoughts on the book, which I thought was excellent. I really, really enjoyed it. Maybe more than I expected that I would. It gave me a perspective about him, yes, but also about art, about society at that time, and just really phenomenal. Now, for me, I don't read a lot of biographies. I normally don't really love biographies for whatever reason. I find them a bit boring to a large extent. I tend to prefer sort of purely educational stuff where I'm learning some particular concept, or pure fiction where it's written as a story narration. And what I found, even from reading sort of historical fiction versions of real people's lives, for example, the Con Ingledon series on Julius Caesar, which generally I enjoyed, but what you end up finding is that in real life, a lot of the dramatic elements of something like an arc plot don't play out, because that's just not how people's lives work, right? And so it just kind of reduces the entertainment value, even though there are some pretty cool things there. This being said, I exceptionally enjoyed this book, and I really recommend it to anyone. I'm not going to give some rating of whatever. I think it's kind of arbitrary in that regard, but a few things that I really took from this book. So the first was, I've been to the Louvre multiple times. I've seen the Mona Lisa multiple times. I, of course, am familiar with Da Vinci as a famous painter, etc. But I can tell you, having attended those places, having looked at these paintings, etc., I would look at them and I'd be like, I don't really like the Mona Lisa. What is it that's so great about this work? I can look over and I can see some other painting in the Louvre and say, looks better to me. Now that's partially a bias because I really don't love portraits that much. It's not really the subject matter that I'm into. That's not to my taste. However, it is something that I also just didn't know how to appreciate what went into Da Vinci's works. And when you read this book, you understand what made Da Vinci so good. It's really, really awesome. So let's just kind of start there, okay? So first of all, it's worth understanding, if you go and look back at Renaissance painting and pre-Renaissance painting, you will notice that the quality of the painting is not very good. So I think one of the problems that I had in viewing Da Vinci as brilliant or not was when you go to a lot of these galleries today, you go to the National Gallery in London, or you go to the Louvre in Paris, or whatever else, you're looking at a lot of Baroque, a lot of Rococo, a lot of later stuff. And so for context, for people who don't understand, you essentially had the Renaissance period, which loosely kind of 1400s, 1500s sort of period. Then the Baroque period came afterwards, and it was a period kind of post-Protestant Reformation, where it was focused heavily on church themes. The church was basically paying a lot of money to commission all sorts of art to sort of edify the church. And the point is, it was later, right? The techniques that they had were later. They were building on the learning. So if you look at somebody like Peter Paul Rubens, who was one of the most famous Baroque painters, Peter Paul Rubens was influenced by Da Vinci. He had famously actually did a version of one of Da Vinci's paintings. And so he benefited from being able to take everything that Da Vinci had learned, which was extraordinary, and which I'll talk about in a second, and put it into his paintings. And there's kind of this thing where the first time you do something, it's much harder than later, right? It's easy to, or not easy, but it's easier to stand on the shoulders of giants. And Da Vinci, I mean, obviously benefited from some of the other people, but not nearly so much. He pioneered a lot of stuff in the world of painting, and as well as many, many other fields. Again, I'll talk about it in a second. So when you go and you look at something like the Mona Lisa, and then you compare it to a Rembrandt. Rembrandt was also a very famous Renaissance painter, Baroque painter. You might be like, well, is Da Vinci better than Rembrandt? Well, the answer is he was much later than Da Vinci. Rembrandt was much later than Da Vinci, and so he got to benefit from Da Vinci's learnings. And so I don't think it's really a fair comparison in that regard. And so I think that you would appreciate Da Vinci a lot more seeing him within the context of Renaissance and pre-Renaissance painting, because in that regard, he is extraordinary. You go and you look at, just go and pick a variety of paintings from the 1400s. So Da Vinci basically lived from the middle of the 1400s until the sort of, it was like 1519, I believe it was, that he died. So he was around 70 years old, just under 70 years old, I believe it was, or around 70 when he died. So, go and compare 1450s paintings to the Mona Lisa, and you will observe a meaningful difference. It is phenomenally better. And so you can understand how, for people of the time, looking at Da Vinci's work, they're like, this guy is extraordinary, okay? So that's point number one. Point number two is there's all sorts of really awesome things to understand in what Da Vinci got into in art. And I didn't understand any of this. It's something that it really bothers me that when I go to places like galleries and museums, etc., that they don't articulate this. I mean, it would be not that difficult today to have some guide on your smartphone that could go very in-depth on pretty much whatever you wanted. You'd have to record it once. I mean, there's literally millions of visitors to the Louvre, etc. It's not like it would be wasted. You could actually transpose that across multiple different galleries where Da Vinci paintings are and things like this. So anyway, I didn't get it, and I really wish that they would articulate this so that I could better understand it. My family was actually, at that time, they were doing, or actually slightly before and overlapping with when I did my trip, they were doing a trip around France. And so they happened to visit, and they were sending pictures to me, and I had a bit of a conversation with my brother, because my brother's an artist who works in the gaming industry. And anyway, so I'm looking at this, I'm just like, why do you guys not articulate this? There's so much here. And I think some of the few cases where I've seen it well articulated are in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. If you go there and you're listening to the recordings of Van Gogh was writing a lot to his brother, who was kind of his benefactor, about painting and his painting techniques and how he was learning at the time. And so we have a lot of information about what he was thinking, and it helped me to appreciate Van Gogh a lot more. Van Gogh is typically not really my style. I'm not blown away by Van Gogh. It's just not to my taste. However, when you learn about his thought process and his development as a painter, etc., I can really appreciate it. It's very identifiable. Now I can see, oh, that's a Van Gogh. That's why it's a Van Gogh. That's what makes it there. That's what he was trying to achieve. That's how he progressed over time, etc., etc., etc. And great, wonderful. Another example is if you go to Barcelona and you go to what is sometimes called Gaudi's house. It's a home that Gaudi designed, and they have this really, really awesome augmented reality tour. and they go through in a ton of detail the different things Gaudi was thinking about. And you learn about how, the way that he has the color on the glass in this room changes because of the angle of the sun at different times of the day in order to affect how the light in the room is. I mean, look around you. I'm sitting here in a room, there's a window over here, window over here. They're just normal windows, right? Gaudi was deeply thoughtful about these things. He was thinking about air circulation at a time when really air circulation was not a big thing. He would pay attention to if you're walking up the stairs holding the railing or you reach to open a door, how does it feel under your hand, whether you're right or left-handed? I mean, just enormous, enormous attention to detail that is not even remotely reflected in almost any modern architect. And I sometimes lament this. I think it's really sad that I talk to architects, I talk to interior designers, I find they're mostly terrible. In fact, I find this across most fields. I find that generally speaking, people are just not excellent at what they do. I think this is your field, this is supposed to be your passion. Wouldn't you want to put every ounce of your soul into this? I mean, if you didn't have Gaudi as an example, then I can understand, but you have Gaudi as an example for over 100 years. Where are all the Gaudis? And I find it's quite lacking. So very disappointing for me as somebody who appreciates all that little stuff. But this is about Da Vinci, so let's talk about some of the things that Da Vinci did. So first of all, Da Vinci had, he was kind of pioneering the use of oil paints. So just the techniques in themselves in terms of the paints that he was using, the types of surfaces that he was painting on, how he would prepare those surfaces, he was pioneering a bunch in that regard. Now, sometimes for the worst. For example, if you look at the Last Supper painting, which is actually in Milan, in this chapel, it really didn't go so well, which meant that the painting degraded substantially over time because the way that he tried to paint on the wall, which was not a traditional fresco way, that didn't really withstand the test of time and started to kind of fall off. And so that's sort of sad because you have this work of extreme masterpiece that we can't really fully appreciate today the way that he did it back then. However, this being said, it's worth just the fact that he did that experimentation, right? Other people get to benefit from it. Next thing, he had an extreme understanding of light, color, the way that light bounces off itself, shadows, perspective. He pioneered the concept of something called acuity perspective. And so let's just give some examples of things that were going on. And by the way, I want to point out something really important to me about Da Vinci, which is, you can clearly say Da Vinci was brilliant, but I actually didn't come away from the book feeling like, oh, it's because his IQ was so high. I tend to reject that notion in general. I think there's lots of evidence to suggest that essentially IQ is a good predictor if it's low, but not so much if it's high. And I don't think what made Da Vinci so great was that he was just so innately brilliant. And I'm sure people will push back on me on that. That's fine, whatever. What I observe is somebody who was not born with this brilliance, but had a deep, insatiable curiosity that he obsessively pursued with an incredible attention to detail over a very long period of time. And the compounding effect of that learning was wonderful to behold. Wonderful, wonderful to behold. So I'll just give some examples of things that I hadn't paid attention to, that Da Vinci paid attention to. And I've lived 40 years or so. Da Vinci was paying attention to this much earlier. Obviously he was a painter, but that being said, so he had noticed that as things go into the background, a few things, meaning that there's distance between you and the subject, that a few things are true. One, of course, we see less detail. And you might say, okay, well, that's normal because of the distance. But actually, it's not just because of the distance. So if you go and look at a bunch of other paintings, what you'll see that they did poorly, that Da Vinci did well in sort of accurately recreating real life, is they would paint too much detail in there. And it gives a sense of it not looking proper, which I wouldn't have appreciated that distinction before. And the reason for this is because actually you have a bunch of air between yourself and the subject, and that volume of air at a sufficient distance basically blurs things, which is quite interesting. The second is that the colors become more muted. So if you see something up close, the color of it is different than at a distance. And so he'll talk about how when you paint these things into the background, you should see a changing of the color, the changing of the detail, etc., as it goes back there in order to reflect reality. Super interesting to know that. It's definitely something that, again, maybe it's obvious, maybe everybody watching this is going to say, that's like, you're such an idiot for not knowing this, but I hadn't noticed that. I hadn't paid attention to it. And so I love that he had this intense attention to detail and would figure these things out. Da Vinci doesn't draw any lines. So he's very against lines because he observed that there are actually no lines on things. And he was way ahead of his time in terms of sort of pioneering the idea of, I want to say, like particles. Here's a guy who, he basically discovered some of Newton's laws, whatever it was, 100 years before Newton discovered a bunch of Newton's laws. Now, he was not good at mathematics, which also speaks a little bit to the fact that he was not just inherently brilliant. He actually struggled with math quite a bit, so he didn't have the math to express what Newton had. And let's not take away from Newton, obviously, developing calculus and all these different things. Newton was a really significant figure. That was very cool. But Da Vinci had these deep observations, and it was just figuring these things out observationally and experimentally. So very, very interesting that he was able to do that. The next thing that we have along those lines is when he was doing this, he would pay a lot of attention to anatomy. And I didn't really understand. Da Vinci probably understood anatomy better than 99.9% of doctors today. He discovered things about the heart that were not rediscovered until the 1900s, if you can imagine that. That's insane. He dissected, when I say this number, to me, the number itself doesn't sound that impressive, but when you get into the detail of each of his dissections, it becomes impressive. He dissected about 30 different bodies, plus bodies of animals, etc. And what he would do, he would kind of like fantasize about writing these books about anatomy, and he would draw each of the different parts of the body rendered in 3 different perspectives, so you could get a full sense of, whether it's a bone or a limb or the skull, etc. There's a very interesting anatomical drawing of a skull that he did that to this day is probably one of the most accurate representations in the style that he invented in order to be able to show, basically had it sawed in half, and to give a sense of what the skull was like. He would do things like following each of the nerves in your face to observe which muscles were affected by which nerves, and how the muscles were connected. And so if you had a particular feeling, how that would cause certain muscles in your face to respond together and not separately. Super interesting. Like, who does this? This is extraordinary, Like, to think that a painter has gone to such extreme lengths. He would go and he would measure people and their proportions in extreme detail. He would pay attention to how the nervous system works and breaks off, how the circulatory system works and breaks off, observe each of the different muscles. He would intimately be familiar with what the muscles were and how much they would lengthen or shorten depending on different movements, so that he could accurately represent anatomy in his paintings. That's crazy. Like, I would be skeptical that many, if any, of the Baroque, Rococo, and even modern painters had that level of understanding about anatomy and could reflect it in their paintings. Like, really, really cool how he did that. We can think about perspective, okay? So when it comes to perspective, for example, the Last Supper is probably a really good example of this. So the Last Supper, if you're not familiar, is essentially a mural. So it's quite wide, quite a large painting in this monastery. And because of this, he knew that the distance from the observer, he kind of designed it for the observer to be at a certain place. And so you've got a certain distance from you to the object, but he realized that because it's across a flat wall, that it would be farther over here than it would be over here. And so he distorts the perspective to reflect that in order to make this work. He kind of designs it into the building itself in order to make it so that it almost seems to be a part of this chapel, this monastery. And so that's just really, really cool that he's thinking so much from like, okay, well, depending on where the observer is, how does that make a difference here, etc. He obsessed over how to communicate emotion in paintings. He would go out and he would sit in public and he would observe different people and observe how they were and observe how to like make the emotions come there. And what you'll notice, again, if you observe especially later Da Vinci works and compare them to the works of, again, Renaissance type painters, paintings from the 1400s, I mean, they're kind of dead. They lack the emotion and life that Da Vinci was so good at communicating in these very subtle ways. And part of that was taking the time to understand, you know, how do the muscles move? Which muscles are going to move together? What is going on in terms of the skin? How does, you know, this represent like the lengthening and shortening of different things? When you turn, he would pay attention to, you know, what goes on with the fabric. How is the fabric going to pull in one way or another? How is it going to fold and crease? How does the light hit that? Like incredible, incredible attention to detail that was simply brilliant. It was really, really amazing. And so it's obviously a big thing just to understand that, and then it's an even bigger thing to be able to represent that in painting. So that's super cool. I think that's really, really fascinating. Other things that he did, I mean, studying things like the movement of water and learning all sorts of different things about fluid dynamics and how these work. He designed all sorts of things from an engineering perspective. This was a guy who, I mean, he was commissioned to do this sculpture of this horse, and he didn't just design the horse, he designed the casting system for the horse to figure out how do you cast this thing properly in these different ways, and designed that system. He's famous for, you know, thinking up the first scuba gear or the first helicopters. He was kind of obsessed with flying machines and things like that. And we can kind of just go on and on and on. The architecture that he was involved in, and the movement or the way that forces apply onto arches and other structures, like thinking about the design of cities and how those would play out. Brilliant, brilliant guy. And when you look at his paintings and you understand all of this, now, at least for me, I can look at it and I can be like, okay, now I see what's so good about it. And now I see the innovations that came into play. I see what he was trying to do. And yes, granted, there are kind of innovations that came afterwards. If you look at somebody like Caravaggio, who was a painter from the Baroque period, also from Italy, and you kind of observe his paintings, you're going to see that the way that he does them are kind of designed to like tell this story, and there's a particular style that he's doing there. You'll notice that kind of later in Baroque and Rococo painting, they moved to isometric perspectives, and not isometric perspectives, moved to, anyway, words slipping my brain, but the bottom line is that, you know, the style changed somewhat, and they learned some different things there. Okay, cool. Oh, here's another thing that's insane. So he would have done a study on plants and rocks, and he deeply understood how the rocks would look and how the plants would look. And so when you have an actual Da Vinci painting versus a not Da Vinci painting, what you'll see, because he would sometimes collaborate with people in his workshop or things like this, or etc. If you have a painting that is a Da Vinci, the rocks that are included in there will be real rocks. They won't be fake rocks. It's not like somebody was like, oh, here's like a loose concept of what a rock is and paint it. No, it will be a real rock, and he will have thought of which rocks would be together in that particular environment so it matches. It's not like it's out of place where you're going, oh, hang on a minute, sandstone and this other type of rock don't exist in the same place. No, he will have that detail correct. Then the flowers that are in there, which are the background of a scene, right, will be real flowers and will be rendered properly. It's not just some, like, it's very easy for somebody to go, and if you look at a lot of paintings, they sort of go, okay, let's put a little few white dots here that are, you know, going to represent these flowers in this garden. No. When it's Da Vinci, it's a real flower, and it is accurately representing the shape and textures and the way that light hits them, etc., of these flowers. It's incredible, just incredible what this guy did in that regard. And so I really appreciate that. To me, when I read books like this, and what I like reading about these books is I, from a very early age, always wanted to be somebody great. I always wanted to be great at things. And so I find it super inspiring. It's very like aspirational for me to appreciate this sort of like the learning of somebody like this who really was, I mean, if you think about it, it's pretty rare in most periods of time that there was somebody who truly stood out, definitively being the greatest within their field. So let's just use a quick example of this. I was on a Napoleon tour. Napoleon is revered as this great general and, tactician and a bunch of other stuff. But the reality is, you also had the Duke of Wellington at the same time. So it's like, there was sort of, it's not necessarily that clear that Napoleon was definitively head and shoulders above the rest. It's definitively true that Da Vinci was head and shoulders above the rest of his time. There's some interesting stuff in the book about Michelangelo and he and some of the things that went on with that. And obviously, look, let's not take away from Michelangelo as a sculptor and a painter, but when you kind of go through the details of what Da Vinci did, I mean, to me, it's just no contest. Da Vinci was so clearly ahead in so many ways that it's very, very hard to put anyone else on the same level at that period of time. And that's really awesome. I think that's something that we can do. Another thing I got out of the book is, as I was saying, Da Vinci was not very good at math. Okay. Now, math is cool because it's one way of thinking about a topic. And one of the ideas I've been exploring a bit lately, and I'll probably do a video about in the future, is how do you think about different topics? How do you engage with them in such a way that you develop understanding inside of your brain rather than memorization? And the way that Da Vinci did that was through drawing. So some people can do it through writing, some people can do it through math, etc. For him, it was drawing. He would draw all these different things. And one of the things that I hadn't really appreciated until reading the book and thinking about it is, you can take a photograph. Think about anatomy, right? I can take a photograph and I can be more accurate to color and to detail in a photograph than I can in a drawing. This is just inherently the case, right? It's very, very difficult to capture the same level of detail and accuracy with a drawing as I can with a photograph, and even more so if I have a video. But the difference is, when you photograph or photograph or video something, it's sort of a passive engagement with the subject. So you're not forced to recognize these little details. The act of drawing it requires that you pay attention to all these little intricacies and details and nuances, and you explore it in a way that you just won't necessarily. It's very difficult to do purely through photographs. Obviously you can through photographs, but the process itself almost inherently means that you won't. And so I'm not a good drawer. I'm terrible. I have no painting skills, nothing like that. But I may start to do a bunch more, sketching, drawing, etc. Not because of the fact that I aim to be good at those things, but because the process, I think, can help me to think about things. And that helps me to understand them better, which then has ripple effects down the road. So yeah, highly recommend the book, Leonardo Da Vinci by Walter Isaacson. Really excellent if you want to learn about painting and art, about what went into some of these incredible people, as well as learn a little bit about society at the time. That is awesome. If you want to be inspired by somebody who was really, really extraordinary within history, it's fantastic. And the last thing that I will kind of mention that I really was appreciating, and I hadn't thought that much about, is Da Vinci spent a lot of his life living at the court of various different noblemen of the time. And this is something we don't have today. I have sometimes lamented the lack of sort of patrons for the arts, etc. I am highly critical of this. I make the statement that wealth is wasted on the wealthy, and I think that anyone who was supporting Da Vinci at the time, that was money well spent, not because of the output. Da Vinci actually didn't finish much work. That was kind of one of his weaknesses. He had basically was constantly distracted, a million ideas, didn't complete hardly any of them. If you were just to kind of give some comparison, I believe it was Peter Paul Rubens has something like, I don't know, 12 or 1400 completed paintings. And Da Vinci that actually were completed is like 15. Like, it's very, very few. Most of his works are not completed. All his notebooks are kind of like one of the treasure troves of information about him. That being said, there was so much put out there that was really, really awesome. And so I think this idea of courts is something that we should revive in the modern day, and it's something that I may work on reviving myself over the next, 10 to 30 years or something like that. You have this large place, you can bring people together who are passionate about developing in their particular craft. In those cases, one of the things they would do is they would use it to organize, in some parts, entertainment, dissertations, discussions, etc. I think it's an awesome idea to bring these people physically together, to have kind of an economic model that they can run on. They're basically given, some sort of a wage to be there, and I think it can become like this really cool place where people want to come and meet with these other people who are really exceptional. So I loved reading about that. I found that really inspiring. It's something that I may work on over time. I guess the last point that was worth thinking about to me, so kind of my form of artistic expression is writing, and I have these various different books and book series that I've worked on over many years, etc. Da Vinci worked on the Mona Lisa, I want to say like 15 years or something like that. And to me, I don't write for anybody else, I write for myself. The idea is sort of like, I write the books that I want to read, but it's a quality versus quantity sort of approach from my standpoint. I think the idea is to try and make them as good as you can, and you iterate over it. I may do a video on writing at some point in time talking about, because I kind of have some views on that. But basically, he continued to improve over and over as his understanding of these different fields increased. He would continue to work on these paintings and add more and more details to them to reflect that new understanding. And I got like a really interesting sense of how a masterpiece is created through reading about Da Vinci and his kind of iterative work in some of these things. And as we're kind of in this space of AI right now, I think about AI tools. And at first you can ask, okay, well, will AI displace artists? And certainly, the AI, I think if you're just somebody who sort of mass produces, then yes, AI, like, boom, it can replace a lot of stuff. But the thing about it is, if you were to imagine using a piece of AI to create something like Da Vinci does, well, the issue is that you wouldn't even know how to direct the AI if you hadn't done the intense study he had into these issues like anatomy, like how emotions are portrayed, how movement is portrayed, how light affects these things, how these flowers are, how these rocks are, which rocks will be together. Like, in theory, you could get an AI to recreate something like that, in theory, but it would require that the AI thinks to do that. And in order to get it to think that way, the person who is creating it more or less needs to have that understanding in order to correct and adjust it. And I just don't see that happening anytime soon. It's similar if you think about, I watched a video on architects versus AI, and they were having buildings built that are designed by architects and buildings designed by AI. And in terms of consumer preference, the AI beat the architects. Now they pointed out, there are some things about that. And one of them is the architecture created by the AI was not particularly functional. And I think the more layers deep you go with this, the harder it is for the AI. Like, if you imagine the Gaudi attention to detail of I reach out and I grab a door handle, and whether I grab it with my right hand or my left hand, how is it going to feel under my hand? And AI is going to really struggle to do that. It's just like that concept, that injection of attention to detail is it's something that AI is going to struggle with. If you just want to have it randomly create a whole bunch of versions of door handles and you can look and be like, oh, this is a cool design, that's one thing. But this injection of like the tactile sense that the people who are embodying that or living within that space are going to have, very, very difficult. And so, yeah, to me, it's one of the things that hopefully the pressure that AI will create is to elevate the game across dimensions like that, and it will kind of remove a lot of the sort of tedious, slow work that gets done in a bunch of these areas and allows that same energy to be focused into these other areas. Now in practice, I think it probably won't happen for most people, just because most people they just don't have the passion and curiosity and unrelenting obsession and attention to detail that somebody like Da Vinci does. But hopefully competitive pressures kind of force them there in this world where you can have content produced in virtually unlimited amounts, virtually for free. And I find that inspiring as something to work on in my own stuff. Let me know what you guys think. Put it in the comments below. I'll see you all later.